We're going to go ahead and get started, at least with some introductions. I'm Phil Metzler with the Community Resilience Guild. David Lehman Miller, as well as Twyla Albrecht, have really helped pull the vision for this series together and help us think about how we can bring some of the work we're doing out into public view more. A lot of that work, from our perspective, starts to look like something like this diagram that's in your program. It's our way of mapping a lot of the information and resources that are out there, connecting the dots, if you will. And what exists here statically on paper, if you find it online, you'll be able to really interact with it. I'm not going to spend a lot of time up front initially introducing Aaron Swatsky Kingsley here, because this whole event is really kind of an introduction to him and his work. I am very fortunate to not only introduce him as a speaker, but as my brother-in-law, my friend, my neighbor. I've known Aaron now for about 20 years since I started dating his sister, now my wife, Sarah, and have really enjoyed seeing, as Sarah and I were living abroad and all around the country, Aaron stayed close to home, and he's been this great reference point over the years of somebody who stayed very deeply committed to a place. And watching them kind of grow into their land, which you see up here. And I am lucky enough to spend trips to family reunions and such, talking at length with Aaron about deep topics and really getting a wonderful glimpse into his mind and the way he perceives the world. And I'm very pleased to share that with you here this evening. So, Aaron, I think the way we wanted to start off was just by giving you an opportunity to tell a little bit of your story as to how you ended up here, both in terms of this place, where you're coming from, and what has brought you to be so deeply committed to this place.
Turn it on. I should thank my parents my parents are here, and that's the reason I'm here. Hi, Mom and Dad. Their parents were in Indiana before them too, so that's how I come to be in this part of the world from a genealogical standpoint. I grew up in Elkhart, and growing up in South Central Elkhart, in a fairly inner city sort of neighborhood, one of the things that were present in that neighborhood were trees, and a mulberry tree in particular is one of those trees that has stayed with me through my life. This was a large, breaking down mulberry that was halfway down the alley in Mr. Applewhite's backyard, and it had one large limb in particular that broke down all the way to the ground and could just kind of climb up it into the tree and harvest the mulberries. And I remember playing in that tree with friends, by myself sometimes, I think. It's a little hard to remember. Walking our dog up and down that alley. That tree has continued to be, the memory of that tree has continued to be an important reference point for me throughout my life. So one of the things that has continued to be also very important to me is writing and storytelling. And that's part of what we want to touch on here this evening. I don't think of myself as a writer. I think of my brother, who's walking in right here, as a much better storyteller. There he is. But I have always wanted to be a writer, and I've always wanted to be a storyteller. I've always been very interested in writing and storytelling. I've spent a lot of time working on writing and storytelling through my life. I don't know, there isn't much to show for it, much success to show for it, but it's something that I continue to work at and craft anyways. when I was a senior in high school, I began to write a story about a girl who climbed up into a tree, a mulberry tree, and never came down again. It's a story that was never finished. It was going to be the great American novel. Maybe it still will. I don't know. And it was that mulberry tree that I had in mind, the mulberry tree that I was referencing earlier. And it wasn't until much later, even 4 or 5 years ago, that much later, I'm 44, so it's been more than 20 years since I started that story. It wasn't until much later that I realized that story I was writing about myself. I should have known at the age when I began, but of course when you're 18 you don't have that kind of perspective. But it was a story that I was writing about not wanting to grow up, not wanting to leave home, not wanting to leave my neighborhood, my friends. I wanted to climb up into that tree and stay there. I tell that story because the years between beginning to write that story and realizing who it was about were the years in which I stumbled into forestry, into urban forestry, and into the vocation that has become so important to me, with the storytelling and the writing on the side. So I went off to college, to Goshen College, because I was going to study literature and I was going to learn how to become a good writer so that I could, become a great novelist. And I graduated with an English degree. I didn't entertain much of the sciences, chemical or physical, or there wasn't much for natural sciences at that point either. That was just coming in. And my friends all stayed around. My closest friends all stayed in Goshen for one reason or another. This is one of the great mysteries to me in my life, is that while many other Goshen College graduates were heading out to Seattle or Philadelphia or Denver or LA or New York, my closest friends stayed, and so I wasn't going to go. And I didn't really have a burning need to go either. I have keen memories of late winter nights walking through, this would be Franklin Street, across the tracks, down behind Goshen Rubber on 10th Street, over to the house where my good friend Phil lived, and he was getting off work at Oak Lawn at 11 o'clock, and I was going over there to hang out with him for the next 3 hours. And I have these memories of walking through the snow on a winter night and the steam that's coming up out of these factories, and thinking to myself, this is weirdly beautiful. This is weirdly attractive to me. I don't want to work in that factory, but this is an interesting place to be. I stayed, and my friends stayed, and we formed a band, and that was a real central anchor in some important ways, because my nuclear family, they were going all over the world. My parents went to Argentina. My sister and Phil went to Chile. My brother went to Paraguay. And there I was. I don't resent at all that they went to those different places. I think I felt like them being scattered around the world was permission for me to stay. Since they were out there experiencing different places in the world, it was okay for me to stay where I was.
So, for the first 10 years that I knew you, you were a part of Double Barrel Darrell, and so that was part of my association with Aaron, was as this frontman for this band, and that's where I saw a lot of his creative talents emerge. And I knew he had this passion for trees, but it wasn't quite the same as what he was pouring into his music. But if I remember, so this wasn't something we talked about bringing up, but you almost did leave. And that's part of the story of connecting to place. And so, I mean, talk about that transition into your plot of land, you know, what you
Right.
call home now.
Thanks. That's a really important, a really critical transition. So, I almost pulled myself up to go to Antarctica. Of all places to go. So a good friend of mine, Greg Lehman, some of you probably know him, had been spending half of the year in Antarctica, just working as a laborer in some of the research labs there, and they need people to cook and clean while the researchers do the important research. And so I signed up to do this too, and I had all my papers in line, my passport, everything was ready to go. And then I began, a relationship with a woman who became my wife. And then two, I was out for an afternoon bike ride just about a week before I was going to leave to Antarctica. And I rode up County Road 21. I didn't know it was County Road 21. I rode up through this beautiful little neighborhood with an Orthodox church on one side and another Orthodox church, lo and behold, on the other side. Up over the hill, these quaint little brick houses, and I came down the hill on the other side, and there was a sign that said 10 acres for sale. And I came to a halt in the driveway, and I looked in. I looked in that driveway, and there was a little farmhouse there, and behind it there was a tangle of woods that I couldn't tell anything about other than that it was a tangle of woods. I wasn't a forester then. I was working in a bakery and I was writing in the evening. But I saw that sign and I saw that place, and all of the lights went on. And the short story is I talked my good friend Phil, who was in the band, and this woman who I was beginning a relationship with, into buying this property with me. So one of the great mysteries in my life is that my friends decided not to move away from Goshen. The second great mystery is that these two people decided to help me buy this piece of land before I was married to either of them. I ended up only marrying one of them. I didn't divorce the other, but I didn't marry him either.
It's remarkable to me. I mean, number one, this is a very original piece of land in the sense that it hadn't been farmed it hadn't been really touched for 50 years when you bought it. I mean, in terms of having gone from farmland to just a succession into the woods that are on it now. But it was pretty much within the first year or few months of you moving onto that property that I went on my first date with Sarah, and we went out there to visit you guys, and we walked all the way back to the far end of the property and climbed a tree, and had one of our first conversations.
I didn't know that.
But it's incredibly special for us as we have traveled around to have this one place to keep coming back to. And it was about 8 years ago that we got a call after Aaron and Nathan had decided to both move into this land and build a new house, that the house next door was for sale. So that's where we live now, is in this house just to the right. And just feel incredibly blessed to be in a place that's new to us, but that has some history to it. So it's your staying in place that has really kind of created a place for us. Going into, it was while living here that you transitioned into becoming a forester. And so how has your love of trees been reflected in your inhabiting of this particular place, in terms of your perception of both that locale, but then also growing into how you perceive this larger community that you've stayed committed to as well.
So, like I said, I didn't. When we bought the property and we moved into the property, I didn't have forestry in mind. What I had in mind was my Aunt Sue Ellen's 80 acres in the UP in mind of beautiful, to me at that time, pristine land, forested and meadowed, no running water, no electricity, ideal and idyllic. That's what I had in mind. So we moved into the property, and so I began to explore, and it was through exploring and hiking through this land and encountering plants that I didn't know or understand, trees that I didn't know or understand, breaking out in these horrible rashes, that would spread all over, and not comprehending what it was about. I don't get poison ivy. I'm 20-some years old. I've never had poison ivy before. It couldn't be. Well, where's the poison sumac? Where's the poison oak? There's none here. And eventually, I invited a bioprof from the college, Mary Linton, to come over and help me identify what in the world was going on. And we hiked halfway back into the property where it was a little more open, and she said, "Oh Lord, I have never seen such a healthy crop of poison ivy in my life." I said, "What? Where?" So I obviously didn't know what poison ivy was, and got pretty well educated after that. But as I was exploring, I was encountering trees, and I was encountering marks on the land, furrows, clearly furrows that somebody had plowed 40, 50 years ago and walked away from. Trees creeping in from the edge, from the forest at the very back, and trying to learn how to identify what these trees were. I could recognize oaks, I could recognize maples, and I began to think about, well, maybe I should dig this one up over here and put it over here, and let's see how that works. And started learning about transplanting trees, how small, how big I could manage, some failing, some succeeding, and that was how I began to think about trees, not as vocation by any means, but as something that was worthy of my interest, beyond this mulberry in the early part of my childhood. One day I got a phone call from my friend Eric Kurtz, who I didn't even know that he was on the Goshen Tree Board. I didn't even know there was a Goshen Tree Board. But he called me up and he said, "So the city is looking to hire a forester. The city has created a forestry position, and I think you should apply for this." And I laughed at him because no background. This is just a little bit of a hobby. But I was looking for something different than what I was doing, and I applied. I got called in for an interview somehow. I got called back for a second interview somehow. I remember riding in my wife's truck up over the 15 overpass going for this second interview, thinking, this doesn't make any sense. This doesn't make any sense. And I guess I was excited or enthusiastic or something, and they hired me. They hired me. The city hired me. A more sober way to think about that for me is to recognize that my socioeconomic and intellectual background conferred in large part because of the color of my skin. That's part of the story. That's part of the reason that the city takes a chance on somebody like me who doesn't have any background. And I think it's important to recognize that, partly because there are many other qualified people for a job like mine. Many other more qualified by now people. I'm extremely lucky to have stumbled into the forestry position here in the city of Goshen. But I credit this land. This land taught me about trees, continues to teach me about trees, and that's the reason that that I have the job that I have, because this was where I learned to appreciate trees and began to think about them in a new way.
I think this could be part of where we get into a bit of a choose your own adventure here, because there's a number of things that you brought into the job that people might not have expected to get out of somebody coming at it without the experience that you had not coming from a forestry background. So, I mean, there's the education and the role that you've played working with schools as one thing we've talked about highlighting. There's the writing that you do as well through the column that has enabled you to kind of share some of the stories that you encounter as you're working with people. And then, of course, there's like kind of the broader narrative that you're developing of how forestry is part of the identity of the community, which feels like the easiest segue for you at this point.
Let's go to the title, Forest People. Forest People Stories, and that will point us towards some of the work that I've been able to do with some schools.
Okay.
So let's
run the one video.
Direction.
So this is part of what we're trying to do with these is to share with you or give you some jumping off points into some of the information that we've helped compile and gather here over the past few years of working with Aaron. There are two things that you'll find in particular. One is this. This is a presentation that Aaron has developed and has been giving locally and elsewhere in the state. You can find a link to the full video, but this is one excerpt to it. There are also some other videos that we'll touch on later, but this is one excerpt that inspired the title for this event.
One of the things that I get to do when I have younger audiences is we often go out into the woods and we take a hike. And one of the places that we always stop is there's a rock foundation of an old barn, and it's completely surrounded now by trees. The barn has been gone for 40 years, as far as I can tell. And we stop and we look at this, and I ask the kids, how did this happen that once upon a time there was a barn here and now there are trees? And they get around to the idea, well, that once the barn and the farm was abandoned, then the trees just grew. And so then I say to them, so what would happen if you and your family left your house and you all moved away for 10, 15 years, which is an expansive time that they can't imagine, but if they moved away and nobody mowed for that period of time, what would you find when you came back? And they know just by looking around them that the trees would grow. Their places would turn into a small forest, right? We know this. And so then I say to them, now the thing about the place where we live is that it has this incredibly regenerative ability to bring forth trees, just kind of hopelessly. Some people express this as a bane. I don't think it is. And part of what it means is that here in Goshen, in northern Indiana where we live, wherever you look, even if it's way out on the horizon, what do we see? We see trees. We see trees. And what this means, I think, is that we are forest people. And so I present this to these young kids. I say, that's who we are. We are forest people. And understanding who we are, at that point, then we're ready to continue our walk into the woods and kind of have the lights come on a little bit more. But that's, I extend that to them, and I want to extend that to us here too, to you here. We are forest people. If we live here, that's who we are.
So that is a theme that I've been working on especially with elementary age kids that I have the great privilege to work with in the Parks Department at the Wreath Interpretive Center. We have a steadily growing program with kids coming to the Wreath Center, and we take them out into the woods and talk about what a forest is and how it works, and talking about the fact, I think, that we are forest people. Forests are one of our greatest natural heritages here. Yes, there we are. These are, I believe these are Parksiders. I've also, through my sister, Sarah, been working with Chamberlain Elementary third graders. And we've had a lot of fun, and the third grade teachers and my sister have done a fantastic amount of work to kind of build trees and forestry concepts into their curriculum. And she can explain those details much better than I can. I just get to show up and walk through Walnut Park with these kids and park ourselves under this gigantic 200-year-old oak tree and talk about how this oak tree allows us to look 200 years into the past. And then I have a tiny little oak seedling that I brought from our nursery, and I say, and this one helps us to look 200 years into the future. So I get to do the fun stuff, but it's been a great opportunity to work directly with these kids to help me hone some of the story that I think is important to tell about ourselves here in Goshen, where we're the Maple City. I'm trying to circle back around to the video here that my sister helped to put together.
Can you find the how to plant a tree? Yeah, this is a pretty good example of something you wouldn't typically expect out of one of your city employees as going above and beyond how to gift a particular class with the instruction beyond just a walking tour.
There we go.
Hey, what are you doing?
I'm planting a tree.
That's not a tree.
It came from a tree.
You can't plant that. Get that out of there. You can't.
Then we'll get it out of here. However, I will get something else in. And by which I mean you.
What? You can't. No, you can't plant me.
Yes, I can. I can do whatever I want.
I'm not a tree. Help! Help! Help!
Quiet.
I'm Tree Girl. You look like you need help.
Well, I could. This fella tried to plant a board, and then he tried to plant me.
Well, I can help you. Need my tree planting tools. Let's see what I got here.
You got anything else in there?
Nuh-uh.
You sure? Don't you have a tree in there, maybe?
Oh, yeah. Not in there. It is. Here it is. Let's go plant it.
Number 1, find the right spot. Good soil, plenty of room, and plenty of sun. Dig a hole for all the roots of the tree. Not too deep, not too shallow. Have an adult check for utilities. Call 811. Number 3, put the roots in. Not too deep, not too shallow. Be sure you know which are the roots.
Well, now I'm going to put the roots in the hole.
Put water in the hole. Put the dirt in. Firm it gently. Add mulch. Then water often. Oh, really? Oh, got you. Oh, I got you.
So this is a short piece that, as I understand it, continues to get quite a bit of use years after it was originally put together, because it resonates with the kids. They like it, and it was done for them at Chamberlain. So, but this is also some of the education that you get to do with the broader community in terms of tree planting and helping create as many opportunities for people to plant trees throughout the different neighborhoods. So perhaps you could speak to how you've seen that kind of help shape both your work and your role through the Parks Department, but also how you see yourself then using some of these different skills of communication and writing and all to help get more people thinking about trees, and not just thinking about, but actively planting and increasing our urban forest here in the community.
Well, so the trick the trick with urban forestry is, as I have come to understand it, as I interpret it, is how to get people and trees to work together, to live together thoughtfully, and trees are thoughtful. Trees are sentient creatures, believe it or not, and people are too. So working with kids to embed some of these sensibilities is a really critical way to begin helping this to happen. So I'm going to circle around to answering here. One of the best moments that I've witnessed was at our Arbor Day celebration this past April, when the third graders from Chamberlain and Model came, and their choirs sang for the people who were gathered there. This is kind of a regular feature of our Arbor Day celebration, where the third graders sing. And unbeknownst to me, there were several middle school kids who also showed up for the celebration, and heard the singing and came up and kind of hovered on the edge of the kids who were singing. And as they finished their song, they clapped, just wildly and enthusiastically, and high-fived kids on the edge of the choir there. And I discovered afterwards that they had been Chamberlain students 4 or 5 years prior, and had sung in those choirs too, and were remembering what that experience was like. I had planted a tree with those middle school kids earlier in the day, and so there were all these different streams of information that were kind of coming together in that moment for them, for the third graders, and for me. And it was just a really touching moment to see the middle school kids affirming what the third grade kids were doing, and the meaningfulness of it. And I can only hope that will continue to carry forward. And that's the educational work that is fundamental to building, to growing a really healthy urban forest. Of course, it's important to find ways to work with the adults too. And I want to also say that I'm not just teaching. I'm always learning from the kids and from adults. And so one of the great things that I get to do is put together volunteer plantings, where we can go out into neighborhoods and plant trees together and talk about why that's important. And I can hear from people, there are horror stories of trees and why they're maybe a little bit leery of them, and then maybe kind of shepherd them along to helping to look after their neighbor's new tree or something like that. What were you going to say? Or so one of the things that that happened in the wake of emerald ash borer arriving in Goshen was, and we can circle back to emerald ash borer. That would be good. But we were awarded a tree planting grant to help replace many ash trees that were lost, and an important component of that was some sort of media component to help all of us understand why it's important to replace these trees that were lost, and that became an eye-opening experience for me about engaging local media, which is not something that I knew how to do or had any experience in doing. I ended up working with 5 Core Media from Goshen College, which you mentioned earlier, for your subsequent event, to create some videos about our urban forest and about their value, economic but otherwise intrinsic also. So maybe this is a good moment to show some of that too.
Yeah, this was the other part of your very intentional part of the grant, right, for public education and outreach.
Yeah, yeah.
Goshen, ecologically, without trees, would not be what it has been for ages.
Trees benefit and enhance Goshen because they provide that aesthetic beauty.
I can go on a bike ride and just be in awe of all the color that is around me.
The wonderful riparian corridor that runs north and south through town that follows Elkhart River is just a priceless kind of gem. And that's something that we'll have forever as long as we understand its value.
Trees enhance the aesthetic value of your home and improve the curb appeal of your property. They also provide shelter from the elements.
In the summertime, we have lots of shade. In the wintertime, the leaves fall and allows a south-facing sun to hit the house and warm it up.
We receive an ecological benefit. In an average year, we don't have to spend an equivalent of about $60,000 to remove various pollutants from the air.
Trees provide places that are desirable for people to come together.
We really want the city as a whole to be a comfortable gathering place where people enjoy spending time, and we recognize that trees are an essential component of that.
You can just go down on any sunny day and see that so many people are outside playing, sitting, going and getting some ice cream. Just to be able to see them out and enjoying themselves makes you feel so much better even about your community.
One thing I observe in Goshen is that people are not only invested in trees, but they're actually really passionate about them as well. Our hope is that future generations can appreciate all the investment and resources that we're contributing to make our city forest last. So the diversity of our forest and the care that is required, introducing new tree stock and maintaining what we have is all that will make Goshen continue to really thrive for years to come.
You know, the things that are going on downtown, the revitalization, the trees are an integral part of that. They're part of what makes Goshen, Goshen.
So that's the short version of 4 different videos, I think, which combine into about 15 minutes total, if I remember right. But there's the 4 videos. This is one of the things that really helped me appreciate how you were interpreting or how you were filling your role as forester in a really inspiring way. The fact that you touched on the ecological benefits was one of the videos. went into the economic videos, which was clearly something that was emergent from the research that you were doing and through the city, but then to speak to the social benefits and to the aesthetic benefits in a really creative way. We're woven into all of these videos. It's just a lot of different dimensions that you see when you look at something like an our urban forest through a systems perspective. And that's been one of the touching point, the starting points for a lot of our conversations, is that we're not reducing these things down to a narrow definition of what forestry is or what it takes to be a steward of our urban forests, but really looking at all these social dimensions and cultural dimensions as well. And I know that's really filled out into the Trees and Civic Identity project, but also into some of the other threads. Go with whatever is most at the forefront for you.
Yeah, well, so Phil actually helped me to see and appreciate the systems nature of what we were working at with our urban forestry programs. I was kind of following the leads that made sense to me and kind of pulling different information together. Partly following the leads of the U.S. Forest Service and some research that they were publishing, but Phil really, in the wake of those videos, helped me to appreciate that what we were demonstrating was that trees have these connection points throughout our society, throughout our community. In some really remarkable ways. This was a project that I worked on in a Sunday school class 7 years ago, where I put urban forestry down there, and I asked folks in the Sunday school class to name the things that were most important to them. So we began to make these other bubbles, and then part of my job was to help find the connection to trees from things like jobs, social stability, economic health, and to kind of explain, to kind of interpret some of those things, and that was what the forestry videos were also designed to demonstrate. And like I said, I didn't even fully appreciate, as those videos were being put together, and as we were interviewing people like Gina and some of the other people, and as those videos came together and people began to respond to them, it made me want to start trying to map some of these connections for us. So for instance, down here is crime and justice, and there's a direct link to urban forestry there. And what is that link? Well, it's this amazing bit of research that came out of Chicago originally, and then has been since replicated in Seattle and Los Angeles, where neighborhoods without trees experience much more crime than neighborhoods with trees, and the research tried to justify various variables in order to look at the way that this happens, and exactly what the correlation is not known. But it probably has something to do with the fact that when trees are present in a neighborhood, people are much more willing and able to go out of their homes and be seen and see other people. And so you just have real basic kind of social interaction and people recognizing each other and getting to know each other. In the absence of trees in the summertime when it's hot, like on a day like this, then you stay inside and you don't get to meet each other, and as a result, either real crime or the perception of crime inches up in those neighborhoods without trees and inches down in those neighborhoods with trees. And so that's how that link happens. And that it can also be expressed in just the pure economics of a neighborhood, comparing neighborhoods. There were some great studies that were just taking pictures of high-income neighborhoods and low-income neighborhoods, and the way you can tell from an aerial photograph is where the trees are, and then you go in and look at the census data to confirm that the treed neighborhood has much higher income than the untreed neighborhood. So it's crime and justice, it's social stability, and so a web like this, and this was just a conversational hour with a Sunday school class, thinking about how these things tie together either directly or indirectly. And that's one of the things that I think we have to continue to work at. If we're thinking about story, then this becomes a place where story can be traced out, can be seen. It also is a place where an ecosystem becomes visible, and an ecosystem is a story, where all these components are working together, living together, playing together, fighting together, but managing each other's lives also in symbiotic ways. Urban forestry and trees is not at the center. It shouldn't be at the center. But these other things aren't necessarily at the center either. They're all connected in different ways. So just today, I came back to my office for lunch and discovered that this 92-year-old man was waiting for me there. Somebody who a week and a half ago I made a verbal commitment to get together with today to go and look at some trees with. And I thought that he was supposed to call me back. I'd forgotten. He'd been there for about a half hour. He wasn't upset at all. He was just waiting for me. So we jumped into my truck. He climbed into my truck. I jumped in. And I turned on the AC, and away we went. First, to look at a tree up by the environmental dump, the environmental center up on County Road 19. Sorry, I call it the environmental dump. That's my shorthand. He wanted to confirm whether it was a shingle oak or not. I had never noticed the tree there, but he had. And then we went out to his house, which was just outside of Goshen. That had been my agreement that I would go with him to look at some things there. I didn't know what to expect. I wasn't sure what he wanted. I knew that he was really interested in chestnut trees, and that can be another segue. So we went to his house, and so this guy has been working at grafting nut trees for the past 50 years. And he's got this forested plot, heavily forested plot, but for the past 50 years he's been grafting walnuts to pecans to hickories, and he's been grafting some oak trees in some different ways, and you can walk around his yard and you can see the progression, the succession of trees getting larger and larger, the graft marks still there, and he talked with love about each one of these trees. I could have stayed there all afternoon, I'm sure. He would have talked to me that long. I had a meeting at 1, so we couldn't. But it was just gorgeous to hear this 92-year-old man talk with such reverence about these trees that he'd been working with all these years. and to hear that that he was interested in what was happening in Goshen. Somebody who has been in and around Goshen his whole life, and very curious about the trees that that we're planting in Goshen, and why in hell, he said, would you plant a hackberry? That's like a weed tree. And hackberry has become one of the important trees that I plant. It's a tree that that is an important replacement for ash, which we can no longer plant, right? You wanted to know why in hell we would want to be planting something so dirty as that. And I didn't try to explain. These encounters and these stories, I was only getting the tip of the iceberg with Dwight about what his story is, and how it was that he found his way to the Reese Center, and we began having some conversations already last fall when he brought me some chestnut trees, seedlings that he'd gotten in the mail from the Chestnut Foundation of America, and wanted to, didn't have room for anymore, he didn't think. I probably agree. And so I put them into the nursery. But an example of the kind of person-to-person relationship that I find myself stumbling in and out of almost weekly with different people, and I don't always get to have a real in-depth conversation. However, some of these people kind of push the issue, and that's okay. That's okay sometimes. And that becomes part of the larger story that is woven into and through this forestry work, where here in the Maple City there has been this long-term relationship with trees and with people. Urban forestry must be people and trees. We kind of referenced that earlier. And talking with Dwight, who's been in and around the project that is Goshen for so long, I was hearing the ripples of that story in new ways. Let's see, where am I wandering off?
Do you want to segue into the other? Well, one thing that I appreciate hearing from this is, again, the time that trees force, the time frame that trees oblige you to think about or to think in. That these trees have been around for a long time. Part of what makes the Maple City distinctive is trees that were intentionally planted 100 years ago, anticipating that this was going to have an impact in the community, generations ahead. It wasn't about just what was happening in the moment. It was with this thought to the future and an appreciation for the past. And that's something that's really stood out to me in terms of how you've talked about trees as part of our identity. It's not just the visual aesthetic that they bring, it's the culture that is connected to them in terms of our relationship to these trees. Their relentlessness, their ongoing presence. You can go with that, or you can maybe go touch on the other interaction that I know has been very much at the forefront for you, which is the elm tree over on Cundred Road.
Yeah, let's go with the elm tree and see where that leads. So 9 years ago, another person called me up and asked me to come and look at a large tree. He suspected it was an elm in his backyard. And so I went out to Cundred Road, which is just off of County Road 45, Wilden Avenue, heading northwest out of town, and went into the backyard, and here was this gigantic elm tree. Steve, I think you know this tree, right? I stood under it, and I tried to comprehend the size of this tree and how it could be that it was living and apparently so vibrant. And the reason that I was struck with this is that in the 1920s, a fungus was accidentally introduced into North America that over the following 40, 50 years really essentially wiped out all of the elms in the eastern part of the U.S. And continues to kill them off. In fact, last year, an American elm tree just outside our house, in the matter of 3 weeks, just died, and it's Dutch elm disease is what kills them, and it's what I expect to happen to elms. So here, the large tree in the center is this elm tree, and I arrived at Mr. Lindhorn's house, and I stood under this gigantic elm tree, just flabbergasted that it was there, and it was so healthy and so alive. You know, I talked with Mr. Lindhorn about the tree and about his family that had lived here in this house for 40-some years. And I was also kind of piecing together that just across the railroad, just across the highway from this elm tree is the site where the old Cundard gladiolus farm had been, you know, which was something that began at the end of the 19th century. Amos E. Cundard began hybridizing gladioluses and ended up creating this business that distributed flower bulbs, gladiolus bulbs, all over the U.S. and all around the world. Sold them to royalty in Europe. The mail going in and out of Goshen in the 1920s and 30s, half of it was accounted for going out of this gladiolus farm. So this elm tree began to grow about the time that business began to grow. And Mr. Lindhorn's family came here in the 1960s, and he raised his family there underneath this tree. And I can only imagine that the reason it survived is that it must have been somewhat isolated from other elm trees in the area for some reason, and so never came into contact with Dutch elm disease, or that it had some genetic resistance. And there are individuals like this. I mean that we're aware of these, but I was not aware of any in Goshen or in northern Indiana. There probably are some others, but this one really caught me off guard. And I ended up writing an early piece for the newspaper just about encountering this tree and about his family living with it. You know, so it became this micro story about this tiny property and this singular tree, and the way that it lived here on the outskirts of the Maple City, now surrounded by the Maple City. Maybe part of the reason also that it survives is because as the Maple City, we were busy planting maples instead of elms like everybody else in the eastern part of the United States. And so there were fewer elm here to act as a draw for the fungus. The end of the story, or maybe not the end of the story, is that this spring the tree was cut down, and I was vaguely aware that this was a possibility. The property had been sold. The Lindhorns had died, and the property had been sold. The daughter got into contact with me from Utah to say that she was aware that the new property owner was likely to cut this down. She wasn't asking me to intervene, but just wanted me to be aware, knowing that I had been interested in the tree. And indeed it was cut down before I took the time or made the time to at least have a conversation with the new property owner about the tree and why it is unique, why it's important. So I feel some guilt about not having been on the ball to at least have a conversation. I don't know that I could have done anything about what happened, but the tree is now gone, and I don't know. Well, right, the limbs are still scattered roughly in the drip line of the trunk. The stump sits there, and it's so badly scarred by the chainsaw that I can't even count the rings. But I'm guessing it's about 100 years old, in that range. But the daughter has she was able to get the majority of the trunk and is having several pieces of furniture built out of it, including a table. The micro story is about this tree. The macro story is about Dutch elm disease that continues to persist and to wipe out elm trees that try to make it back, is pushing up into Canada as climate change pushes things north. I was in Winnipeg a couple years ago, where my wife is from, and Winnipeg claims to have the largest urban elm population in the world, and it's amazing. I'd never seen an elm streets lined with elms before until going to Winnipeg, and it's a cathedral experience to walk down a street that is lined with elms, and it wasn't here in Goshen, but many other places in this part of the country once upon a time. The macro story is how the forces of economics and globalization, before that's what we called it, brought a fungus that wiped out the elm. And of course, 40 years before that, it was an earlier version of the same thing that brought a fungus to North America that wiped out the chestnuts, and in the 1890s, and then more recently, in around 2000, the same thing was repeated with a bug that was introduced from Asia that has wiped out our ash trees. And so we wonder what's next. Here as the Maple City, we've dodged 1 bullet, 2 bullets, 3 bullets, but when is it going to be maple? And what are we going to do about that as the Maple City? But more importantly, as a community that has this story of caring for trees and being identified with trees, whether they're maple or otherwise. And so that's kind of the next wrinkle in our story that we have to see how it plays out.
So this is partly why I've been so blessed to kind of have this existing relationship with you, but then to immediately jump in and get to see this community that I've now call home through your perspective. And it's part of what we're trying to do with this series, is to make this kind of perspective more accessible to other people. As we talk about community resilience, and well, as I do in my work with the Resilience Guild, we're focusing on the relationships that shape and define our community, the webs of relationships like an ecosystem, but that extend into the social and economic and other systems as well. This has been really helpful for me to be able to, number one, have at least one framework and where we can really see these relationships made visible, not just kind of structurally, but through the gifts of communication and thinking that you've brought to bear. And that's especially, I think we're especially fortunate to have that as your role evolves and you step into a role where now you're being asked to, within your position, think more longer term about how not just the urban forest, but all of the community's ecosystems continue to grow and develop, knowing that there are changes that we don't necessarily have control over that are coming to impact us. So that's the area that we've been able to collaborate on for the Goshen Environmental Perspectives Assessment that we did to kind of set the table for a potential Environmental Advisory Commission. There's links to that in the map. So do you want to touch on any of that yourself in terms of what you see your work being ahead within your official capacity?
So Phil's referencing to the way that my role has been expanded in the past year, and my role now is to help us think beyond just trees, and there are many folks in Goshen who are already doing that. There's a lot of great work being done with water quality and brownfield reclamation, and thinking about how we can become more efficient in the way that we use our resources. But we are at the point now where the city needs to kind of gather up all of these pieces and kind of look at how they work together, how they fit in relationship to each other, and how we as a community can decide how best to use the resources. So, I mean, our essential resources, as I see them, in Goshen, are human ingenuity, soils, water, and trees. I think because trees are an expression of all of these different things, and these resources experience greater and greater stress as our population continues to grow, and as climate change begins to narrow the ability of our existing ecosystem to function in the way that it has, even as it functions now, which is already diminished from what it once was. And so my expanded role is to, as I'm understanding it, as the city is trying to understand it, is to help us be thoughtful and proactive, and also be appreciative of the vast unknowns that are in front of us. We prefer to think in terms of the things that we know and that we can control, but I think an important thing for us to begin to shift to is recognizing that the things we don't know are the really important variables in front of us, and and resilience means preparing for not knowing how things are going to move around us, and being able to roll with changes, especially climatic changes that are going to change the nature of our ecosystem and therefore our society over the next 100 years, beyond us, into the lifetimes of my children and maybe grandchildren. That's a daunting task, of course, and realistically it's an impossible task, and it's only one that I can begin to think about, and it's not one that I can do on my own. And so part of an appeal here is for all of us to work at these things together. That's the task of urban forestry, and that's the expanded task that now comes to all of us, and that I'm scratching my head thinking about how do I live into that.
Well, I'm glad you're the one kind of stepping into that challenge, because I think coming at it from the standpoint of trees, I mean, trees is just, through this relationship, I've really come to appreciate how trees do provide just a really compelling reference point for thinking about resilience, in terms of they do oblige us to think about what's happening in a longer time frame. They invite us to come together as a community and be in relationship with each other. They force us to collaborate and work together in many senses, as you find even within the city. The streets department having to work with the parks department, having to work with neighborhoods and developers. I mean, it requires a certain kind of coordination, all of which, apart from the ecological benefits, add to our resilience, our ability to kind of react to change and be determined about the change that we want to see. So I'm really grateful for you in that role. There's been a lot of threads that we have touched on here, and this is the hard part of knowing we were going to be going into this event, would be that it's very tough to kind of find a linear path that touches on all the different edges that we would like to bring into focus. So we'll really invite you to follow up on some of the different themes that may have popped up that we would have loved to have come around and gone into greater depth with, but we just won't have time. But that said, I do want to give an opportunity here, if any of you have any questions or there's a specific edge that you were hoping we would come around to or touch on, that you might want to hear some further thoughts from Aaron on yet tonight.
Yeah, so you quoted the person who was cussing about trees, and it just reminded me of the amount of emotional attachment and sometimes anger and sympathy. I mean, just the wild emotions that people feel in relation to trees. And I'm just, and I think I know you enough to know that you've done great work with just helping us to work with those emotions around trees. And I'm just curious what you have learned about dealing with some of those as you work with those high emotions around trees and working with individuals or with communities. What you've discovered about how to face those things and work with that constructively.
So it's probably the first thing that any social work student is taught, which is people just want to be heard. You know, they want to tell their story, and the emotion comes out in the story about this tree, that keeps dropping all of this crap on my lawn and on my car, and So earlier today, I was talking to somebody about their birch tree. Birch trees drop lots and lots of stuff, and they were wondering whether it was time to, to cut it down. And I looked at it, and I said, yes, they are dirty, but this tree is still a really healthy tree, and the way that you can look at it is the beauty of the tree is something that you can continue to appreciate, and part of the price is just this stuff that falls down. So enjoy the beauty of it, and let's look at it in a couple years. Let's look at it again in 4 years, and let's see whether it's deteriorating, and let's see how you feel about it then. I wasn't trying to tell them no, it can't come down, but I was trying to help them see this tree in a different light, and I wanted to hear what their experience of it was, and I find that often, if I'm able to listen carefully, then most of the work has been done. There's been some venting of frustration about a tree, and usually, without me even prodding, the story then turns, and after venting about the tree, people will say, "But I like this about the tree. This is something that I like about the tree," and then my job is done. I mean, we can offer to work on the tree to help clean it up in some ways, but then it becomes livable and workable. Yeah, Steve.
Two issues. a number of years ago, the big wind event came up from between Parkside and Goshen College on 8th Street and around that area. You know, how did people respond to that and feel about that? You know, trees came crashing down, and I think we dodged a bullet. And it's kind of related to Doug's question of how people feel about those big events when trees, they give freely of themselves all their life, but pay a lot at the end. In this case, it was pretty bad, but it could have been a lot worse. And then the other question is this story that you shared about this guy that you met today with the nut trees, which I'm a nut, okay? It takes a nut to start a tree. And so I can be evangelical about hazelnuts. Do you have any ideas about, you know, establishing like an urban nuttery or like a park or something? Or anyway, I talked about it.
Yeah. So the urban nuttery. Patrick Coonan, who you know, he's working really hard at putting together a public orchard, and we've kind of identified Water Tower Park over on 9th Street as a place for that to happen. And he's grafted a bunch of apple trees and some other fruit trees. He hasn't gotten to the nuts yet, but that'll come. And a bunch of those trees are in his backyard, and a bunch more of them are in the nursery, the city nursery. So we're working towards that, I think. So the storm that came through, 8th Street, 7th Street, parts of 6th Street, and then 13th, 14th, 15th, 12th Street, all experienced some severe tree loss, and some of the houses, especially on 8th Street, took some serious damage too. And it was really hard to see big mature trees come down and open up that streetscape, expose it in a way that it hadn't been for 60, 80 plus years. And there were, I think they're almost all maples. I can't think of anything that wasn't maple that came down in that event, or even in the months after, as we were able to assess the damage and recognize that we needed to take other stuff out. So it was hard to see that happen, but then it became an opportunity to begin replanting with non-maple, non-ash species, which is important, because if we've dodged 3 bullets so far, chestnut blight, Dutch elm disease, emerald ash borer, then the only way to be prepared for whatever may come for maple is to diversify what we have. We know that our public street trees are at least 50% maple, and I think if we were to inventory all the trees in the city, we'd be pressing up past 60%. So we have to diversify what's in our city if we want our urban forest to survive in a viable way into the next 100 years. So painful to see that happen, but it becomes an opportunity to rebuild our forest in a healthier way. And my experience is that most people who lost trees in that experience were eager to get something new started. They weren't frightened by it, and maybe that's because they recognize they're not going to be there for another 30 to 60 to 80 years when it becomes a problem again.
I think if there's any additional questions that people have, you're welcome to come up afterwards and ask Aaron directly. But I think in the interest of time, we want to bring things to a close. So yeah, Aaron, and thank you all for your patience and listening to this. This is, again, one of the difficult things without going into this with anything scripted, is not exactly knowing where it's going to go. So thanks for joining us on this learning journey of our own here. So yeah, Aaron, is there anything in brief that you want to say to wrap things up?
Well, so I don't do the work by myself. I do it directly with people like Kendall sitting there in the back, and other folks at the Parks Department. and other folks in the departments throughout the city, but then also with you all who live and work in Goshen. Thank you so much to Phil and Twyla and David and folks here for putting this this series together and inviting me to kind of talk about this. I hope I haven't rambled too much. Try not to be boring or stutter too much, and I'm sorry if I have. A friend of mine called me up yesterday and asked me. He's writing his memoir. He's 70-some years old, and he asked me for my definition of love. He's asking other people that he knows to submit to him their definition of love. And so, I mean, I think a good definition of love is a tree, which is a thing that synthesizes inorganic materials and turns them into, incredible chemical and physical realities that benefit itself, but also are given just abundantly and ridiculously to everything else around it and within it and on it. So maybe that's my last thing.
Well, thank you, Aaron, for all you do here in the community and for joining us here this evening. And we've just scratched the surface of a lot of the writing and the stories and the gifts that Aaron has given to the community. Again, you'll find a lot of that information there, both the technical reports on what's happening with the urban forest and articles in the Naturalized Mid-American and the Goshen News and many other tidbits as well. So we'll be back here in 2 weeks for, again, the event featuring Deep Dive and the work of 5 Corps and the marine biology program at the college. There is a sign-up sheet out there. If you're welcome to sign up if you want to get more information to stay aware of the events that we're going to be doing. And we are doing these free, but we welcome donations to help us continue it. So thank you very much, and feel free to come and let us know if you have any additional questions or input.